Let me answer the question directly, because at 97 years old, I have learned that time should never be wasted on long introductions. Soy protein, including the kind used to make vegetarian meat, can be good for your health, but only if you understand what it really is, how it is made, and how it fits into the rest of your diet. Like many things in life, it is neither a miracle nor a villain. The truth is quieter than that. I did not grow up eating vegetarian meat. When I was young, the idea hardly existed. We ate beans, grains, vegetables, eggs, and sometimes meat when it was available. Soybeans were not a fashionable food. They were simply another plant that people in many parts of the world had eaten for generations. It was much later in my life, long after retirement, that I first became curious about soy protein products that tried to imitate meat. You know the kind I'm talking about. Those small brown crumbles that look like ground beef once they are cooked. Those patties that promise the taste and texture of meat but come entirely from plants. Scientists call the material inside them textured vegetable protein, or sometimes fiber-structured soy protein. At first, I was skeptical. When you reach my age, you have seen too many food trends rise like fireworks and disappear just as quickly. One decade, something is declared a miracle. The next decade, the same food is blamed for every illness in the modern world. But curiosity has kept my mind alive longer than almost anything else. So I began reading. I spoke with doctors. I looked carefully at how soy protein is produced and how it behaves inside the human body. And slowly I realized that the real question is not simply whether soy protein is good or bad. The real question is how this plant-based protein affects the body when it becomes the center of a modern diet. When I first began studying soy protein, I realized that most people argue about it without really knowing what it is. They hear the words vegetarian meat and imagine something mysterious, something manufactured in a laboratory. But the truth is simpler than that and also more complicated. Soybeans themselves are not new to human history. For thousands of years, people have eaten them in many forms: boiled soybeans, tofu, fermented tempeh, and soy milk. In many Asian cultures, soy has long been one of the primary plant sources of protein. Long before modern nutrition science existed, people already understood that soybeans were filling, nourishing, and capable of replacing meat in many meals. But the soy protein used in vegetarian meat is usually not whole soybeans. It is something more refined. Manufacturers take soybeans, remove most of the oil, and concentrate the remaining protein. From that protein, they create what is called textured vegetable protein, or TVP. Through heat, pressure, and extrusion, the protein fibers are rearranged so that they form strands that resemble the texture of meat. When you add water and cook it, the dry granules expand and become chewy. That is why vegetarian ground meat often looks and feels surprisingly similar to animal meat. The structure is built from plant protein fibers. From a nutritional perspective, soy protein has an important quality that many plant foods do not have. It contains all 9 essential amino acids that the human body cannot produce on its own. In other words, it is considered a complete protein. This is the same category that includes eggs, dairy, fish, and meat. For people who choose to eat less animal food, this matters. The body requires amino acids to maintain muscle, repair tissues, support the immune system, and produce hormones and enzymes. Without adequate protein, especially in older age, the body becomes fragile. Soy protein also contains very little saturated fat compared with most animal meats. Diets high in saturated fat have long been associated with increased levels of LDL cholesterol, which is one of the major contributors to cardiovascular disease. Replacing some animal protein with plant protein can help shift that balance. I remember a doctor explaining it to me this way many years ago. When people replace red meat with plant proteins such as soy, beans, or lentils, they often reduce saturated fat intake without even trying. That alone can influence cholesterol levels over time. Soybeans also contain natural compounds called isoflavones. These are plant chemicals that belong to a group known as phytoestrogens. The word sounds frightening to some people because it contains the word estrogen, but phytoestrogens are not the same as human hormones. Their structure is similar, but their activity in the body is much weaker. Researchers have spent decades studying these compounds. Some studies suggest they may help support heart health and improve blood lipid levels. Others have examined their potential effects on bone density and inflammation. When I began looking into this research, what struck me most was how moderate the findings were. Soy was rarely described as a miracle. Instead, it was described as a useful source of plant protein that can fit into a balanced diet. That modest description appealed to me. At 97 years old, I have learned that the most reliable foods are rarely the ones surrounded by dramatic promises. Another advantage of soy protein is its fiber content when it comes from less refined forms. Fiber is one of the quiet protectors of human health. It slows digestion, helps regulate blood sugar, supports the microbiome in the gut, and contributes to long-term metabolic stability. Many diets in modern countries are surprisingly low in fiber. People eat large amounts of refined grains, sugar, and processed animal foods, but very few plant fibers. Adding plant-based proteins often increases fiber intake naturally. But there is another side to the story that must be discussed honestly. Not all vegetarian meat products are nutritionally equal. Some are relatively simple: soy protein, water, a few seasonings, perhaps some vegetable oil. Others are heavily processed and contain long lists of additives, flavor enhancers, stabilizers, colorings, and large amounts of sodium. These ingredients are used to imitate the taste and appearance of meat as closely as possible. When food becomes highly processed, the health picture becomes less clear. Excess sodium can raise blood pressure. Artificial additives may not be harmful in small amounts, but diets dominated by ultra-processed foods rarely support long-term health. This is something I have noticed throughout my life. It is not just soy protein. Any food, when heavily industrialized, can lose some of its natural simplicity. So when people ask me whether vegetarian meat made from soy protein is healthy, my answer is usually another question. What kind of soy product are you eating? Is it close to the original plant, or is it a highly engineered imitation of meat? The difference matters more than most people realize, because the truth is that soy protein itself is not the problem. The real question is how modern food manufacturing shapes the way we consume it, and how often it replaces simpler foods that once formed the foundation of human diets. And that brings us to the deeper concern people often raise when soy enters the conversation. What does it actually do inside the human body over many years of consumption? By the time I reached my 70s, I noticed something interesting whenever soy came up in conversation. People rarely spoke about it calmly. Some praised it as if it were a miracle food that could replace every form of meat. Others warned that it could disrupt hormones, weaken the body, or even cause disease. The truth, as I eventually discovered, was far more balanced than either side imagined. The first health effect researchers often discuss with soy protein is its relationship to heart health. Over the years, a large number of studies have examined how soy protein affects cholesterol levels. The results are not dramatic, but they are consistent. When people replace some animal proteins, particularly red meat, with soy protein, their LDL cholesterol often decreases slightly. Now, that may sound like a small change, but the human body responds to small changes repeated over long periods of time. Lower LDL cholesterol means fewer fatty deposits forming along the inner walls of arteries. Over decades, this can influence the risk of cardiovascular disease. I remember a cardiologist once telling me something that stayed with me. The heart does not respond to one meal. It responds to patterns of eating, patterns of movement, patterns of stress. Soy protein, when used as part of a broader pattern of plant-based foods, can gently move that pattern in a healthier direction. Another aspect researchers often examine is weight management. Protein, regardless of whether it comes from plants or animals, has a way of increasing satiety. It helps people feel full for longer periods of time. For individuals trying to reduce excess weight, replacing some high-fat meats with plant-based protein can reduce overall calorie intake without leaving them hungry. Soy protein is particularly useful in this regard because it contains relatively little saturated fat compared with many animal meats. When the body receives protein without excessive saturated fat, the metabolic burden becomes lighter. But perhaps the most debated topic surrounding soy is the one that causes the most confusion: its effect on hormones. For many years, rumors circulated that soy could feminize men or disrupt hormonal balance. These fears grew from the presence of isoflavones in soybeans. Because isoflavones are classified as phytoestrogens, some people assume they would behave like powerful estrogen inside the human body. Scientific research, however, paints a more careful picture. Isoflavones do interact with estrogen receptors, but their activity is extremely weak compared with the body's own hormones. In many cases, they actually behave more like regulators than stimulators. In environments where estrogen levels are high, they can slightly block stronger estrogen activity. In environments where estrogen is low, they may provide a mild supportive effect. Large population studies examining men who regularly consume soy have not found evidence that soy lowers testosterone levels or damages reproductive health. The same is true for most long-term dietary studies involving women. What researchers generally conclude is that moderate consumption of soy foods is safe for the vast majority of people. That word, moderate, is important. In nutrition, extreme intake of almost any single food can create imbalance. The body thrives on diversity. Another interesting area of research involves the microbiome, the community of microorganisms living in the human digestive system. Soy foods contain compounds that certain gut bacteria can convert into substances believed to have anti-inflammatory properties. Some individuals produce a compound called equal when digesting soy isoflavones, and scientists are still studying its possible health effects. What fascinated me about this research is how deeply the human body collaborates with microorganisms. Our health is not simply determined by what we eat, but by how our internal ecosystems process what we eat. Still, while soy protein itself shows many reasonable benefits, we must return to an issue that has become increasingly important in the modern food environment: processing. When soy protein is transformed into vegetarian meat products, it often travels through an industrial process designed to mimic animal meat. Heat, pressure, flavor additives, oils, and colorings may all be used to recreate the sensory experience people expect from meat. This does not automatically make the food harmful, but it does mean the final product may contain ingredients that did not originally exist in the soybean. Some vegetarian meat substitutes contain significant amounts of sodium in order to enhance flavor. Others include stabilizers or artificial flavor compounds. These additions can make the food more appealing, but they can also distance the final product from the simple nutritional profile of the original plant. Over my long life, I have noticed that the healthiest diets are rarely built on foods designed to imitate other foods. They are built on foods that remain close to their natural form: beans, grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds. Soy protein can certainly be part of such a diet. Tofu, tempeh, and minimally processed soy foods have nourished entire populations for generations. Even textured soy protein, when used occasionally and prepared with simple ingredients, can provide a useful source of plant protein. But when vegetarian meat becomes the centerpiece of every meal, heavily flavored and heavily processed, we may simply be replacing one industrial food with another. In that case, the question is no longer about soy protein itself. The question becomes whether our modern food system has moved too far away from simplicity. And that is the lesson age has slowly taught me. The body responds best not to perfection, but to balance. Soy protein can support health when it replaces some heavier foods, when it appears alongside vegetables and whole grains, and when it is consumed with moderation. But like any food, it works best as part of a larger pattern, one that respects the quiet wisdom of the human body. After 97 years of watching the world change, I have learned that the loudest opinions about food are rarely the most reliable ones. Soy protein, especially the kind used in vegetarian meat, has been praised as a miracle and condemned as a danger. Yet the truth, as it often is with nutrition, lives somewhere in the calm middle ground. Soy protein itself is not an enemy of the body. It provides complete protein, contains beneficial plant compounds, and usually carries far less saturated fat than many animal meats. For people who want to reduce their intake of red meat or explore plant-based eating, soy can be a practical and nourishing option. When used wisely, it can support heart health, provide essential amino acids, and contribute to a balanced diet. But wisdom also requires honesty. Not every product made from soy is automatically healthy. When soy protein becomes part of heavily processed vegetarian meat, packed with excessive sodium, artificial flavors, and long ingredient lists, the health picture becomes less certain. At that point, the food may resemble industrial convenience more than the original soybean that grew in the soil. Age teaches you to notice patterns. The people I have known who stayed strong and clear-minded into old age rarely depended on a single superfood. Their diets were simple, varied, and mostly built around whole foods: beans, vegetables, grains, fruits, and occasional sources of protein, sometimes animal, sometimes plant. Soy can fit beautifully into that kind of pattern. Tofu, tempeh, and even modest amounts of textured soy protein can provide valuable nutrition when they are part of a diverse plate. So when people ask me at 97 whether soy protein vegetarian meat is good for your health, I give them the same answer I give to many questions about food. Yes, it can be, but only when it remains a part of balance, not the center of obsession.